Hello, I'm Ian Shergold, and I'm a research fellow in the Centre for Transport and Society based at UWE in Bristol. I've been researching older people's mobility for about 10 years now, and during that time I've carried out research in both rural and urban areas and looked specifically at things like community transport, concessionary fares, and more recently the potential of autonomous vehicles as a future mobility method for older people. And I'm particularly interested in the role that mobility plays in the well-being of older people. I'm in discussion today here with Professor Glenn Lyons, who is the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at UWE in Bristol. And he describes his current role as helping to equip transport planners to handle deep uncertainty about the future, a particularly important issue at the moment, of course. So Glenn's devoted his career to understanding and influencing travel behaviour in the context of this continuing social and technological change, and he himself has journeyed from engineering into social science, and believes a more socio-technical approach is essential to understanding how we address current challenges and opportunities. And more recently, he's been referred to as a transport sociologist, and perhaps we can get him to explain that term a little as we get into the discussion. So I had the privilege of working with Glenn some 5 years ago now on the impact of non-transport factors on mobility and transport. And we were looking at the role of assistive technologies and what that might mean for older people and their travel needs and behaviours in the future. So another important thing to know about Glenn is that he's actually had this a number of secondments which allowed him to bridge between academia, policy and practice, and has given him hopefully some unique insights in how to those things interoperate. And throughout his work, he's made the argument there's a need for transport planning to evolve in the face of a changing world. And obviously an aging population is one of those key elements of that changing world. So perhaps to begin, Glenn, you could briefly explain what your current role is, which of course is bridging between academia and commercial consultancy. And perhaps give us a flavour of some of the issues and themes that you're currently exploring.
Thanks, Ian, and thank you very much to the conference for this opportunity virtually to be part of it. Yes, so I hold an industrially sponsored chair, which effectively means that I spend half of my time seconded into the world of consultancy and the other half of my time, in theory, continuing to develop more academically oriented thinking about key topics and challenges, which can then be translated from the world of academia out into practice and hopefully turning problems into solutions. And I think that's something I've become very aware of, that as academics, it's not to say that we really do just inhabit ivory towers, but we become very good at understanding the problems society faces and articulating the many facets of those problems, but perhaps less good at resolving them. What's the solution to this problem we've explained, this dynamic in society? And of course, consultancy is a world where you're supporting clients who, yes, they know they have problems, but they really need the answers. So moving from problems to solutions, and I suppose from theory into practice, is a key part of the role. And one of the big challenges within consultancy and the public sector and private sector, of course, is dealing with what we call deep uncertainty now. And I'm talking pre-COVID. COVID has really just underscored in red ink the fact that we are in deeply uncertain times. And the way that we have approached transport planning historically has been given the shorthand of predict and provide, which is the idea that we have some high degree of confidence about how the world is moving forwards that we can then support in the way we invest in the transport system. And that's starting to become more and more fallible as a paradigm, which means we have to think and act differently in transport planning in response to a changing world. And for me, I guess what covers much of my interest and activity is what I've referred to as the digital age colliding and merging with the motor age. So we've had this previous regime, a way of the world that most of us have grown up in personally and professionally, which has been car dominated. But now we're seeing strong signs across the demographic spectrum of change in people's behaviour, as well as lots of technological innovation starting to disrupt the transport space. And my strong belief is that we are in the midst of a fundamental transition from what was the rearview mirror view of the world to a fundamentally different type of mobility and society in the future ahead. The real challenge is we don't quite know what that future looks like. We can be agents of change in moving towards a different future, but we're somewhat at the mercy of external forces, as we've seen with this global pandemic. Perhaps we'll come on to some of the topics I've looked at, but things like connected autonomous vehicles, driverless cars, or another concept which is mobility as a service, which is the idea which has been rather hyped, as have autonomous vehicles, but the idea that in the palm of your hand, you will have an app-based service that provides you with a window into a multimodal transport environment beyond the private car, which will also have a very convenient booking and payment platform, so that you may no longer need to have a car, but can step into this much more accessible and well-connected mobility system. And it's proved very seductive for both industry investing in it, venture capitalists investing in it, but also government getting excited that this will be part of a big economic boost. And I suppose the angle that I've taken, Ian mentioned my socio-technical approach, and it's true of the Centre for Transport and Society at UWE more generally, is to bring some challenge to that perspective. And that challenge comes from a better understanding of the social system within society, as well as the technical system. And I suppose that's probably where I don't label myself a transport sociologist. It's a name that's been attached to me. I probably would be offending at this point any sociologists in your audience.
So in terms of, so you cited a couple of areas there of sort of change that's happening in transport. In what sense do you think the needs and aspirations and expectations of the older part of the population are being looked at in terms of those sorts of innovations, or is it aiming at a different population completely?
I think, I mean, although clearly the focus here is aging, but I think there's a persistent and fundamental challenge regarding the heterogeneity of society, in that, and I'm probably being a bit disingenuous to some of the technological innovators, but we do tend to have, particularly in the transport sector, a rather technologically deterministic view of the opportunities that innovation might provide. And we approach development of solutions focused more on the how to rather than the why to, and the outcomes that will arise. And I suppose the makeup of people who are responsible for creating change in the transport sector, although it has been changing, tends to be very male oriented. In fact, one could go further and say middle class, middle-aged, white male oriented. And as a result, we, I think, have notions of the public when things are being developed, without really stepping back properly and appreciating just how diverse the population is in terms of a number of dimensions, including age. And as a result, I think disappointingly, not of course to suggest no research at all happens on this, but we don't tend to pay particular attention to the social context and life circumstances of particular groups. And that can be particularly the case, of course, for technology-rich solutions, where you're looking perhaps at people developing these opportunities who are at the bleeding edge of what technology has to offer, and rather take for granted that if you move right back into the wider public, and perhaps particularly into much older age groups, the likelihood of being so conversant with that technology, which itself is continuing to change, is diminished. So having mentioned mobility as a service, very immediately, that is excluding people who don't have a smartphone, and of course people who don't really know how to take advantage of having a smartphone to be able to find this new window into a mobility system that is becoming more connected and is argued to be more convenient, but only convenient if you fully understand the technology that's on offer. Similarly, if we move across to autonomous vehicles, and Ian, I know you are probably more expert in this than me, particularly from the perspective of aging, but it's rather been focused upon, I think, a rather functional approach of how do we get these machines to work safely without killing people, to go from A to B, so that in technical terms they work, so the invention itself is established. But the innovation, of course, is really understanding how that invention diffuses into society, and in particular how that might affect older people. So if we associate aging in part with mobility impairments, then yes, it might straightforwardly be that you no longer need to control a vehicle. You can step in as if it were stepping into a taxi. But that doesn't really deal either with the full door-to-door journey. How do you get to that vehicle, and how do you disembark from the vehicle to your destination? But neither does it necessarily address the social needs of individuals in terms of whether we're heading towards a more individualized, isolating society and mobility experience, where there's not even an interaction with a driver or an encounter with other passengers. And I think those issues tend to come more as a secondary reaction to the excitement around what's technologically possible. And in fact, we've just recently been part of a new paper based on a workshop that was run by UCL in London, looking at the role of social science in making sure that the way we develop technologies like autonomous vehicles really does take account properly of the social system.
Okay, so a lot of that change and the new technology is sort of, we're on the cusp of seeing that being delivered to an extent. Perhaps I can ask you just to look forward maybe 5-10 years as to what do you think the next areas of change in transport and mobility are likely to be, or what you're thinking about as those sort of near future changes that are going to be important for everybody, but perhaps in particular for older generations.
Yeah, and important there that you kind of identified near future and perhaps indicatively 5 to 10 years, because I think timescales are significant when we're talking about the future. And my get out of jail free card is that because I believe that the future is deeply uncertain, I'm not going to be drawn into predicting, because I think there really are some very different plausible futures ahead of us, partly determined by how we shape them. If I were looking at the next 5 to 10 years, I would say, first of all, I'm much less expectant that we will see the mobility system overrun by autonomous vehicles and by the fully blown mobility as a service concept and drones in our skies, delivering goods to our doorstep and so on. So that's kind of the big tech, if you like. I think whilst that may make more and more of an impact in the longer term, it has so many obstacles to overcome to move from the lab into society that will be slower burn, if indeed it's still relevant. Meanwhile, I think what we are seeing, which is relevant to all of us, but as you say, perhaps particularly to older people, in a positive and challenging way, is increased digitalization. So all of us now, including this interview, are experiencing a long-run global experiment in how we cope when we have to rely more on a lack of face-to-face interaction in our lives and a substitution through technology. And in many respects, that's proving to be quite robust and supportive in us coping with the global pandemic. But again, it relies upon people both having being technologically equipped, but also having the means and confidence to use those technologies. And one only has to look back over the last 20 years to see how much has changed. So just to give you a quick example, 20 years ago, I would have been trying to do something very crudely relating to this using a 56K modem, which I'm told it would have taken 36 hours to download a high definition movie. Whereas we're on the cusp of 5G, which I'm told it will take 1 second to download an equivalent movie. So the capabilities of the digital developments are far outstripping what the transport sector is able to achieve, I think, in terms of pace. But also, we've tended to overlook in the transport sector where there's been an excitement around big technology, the more humble developments that are already pervasive in society, particularly walking and cycling. Cycling has had a real injection, as has walking during the pandemic. But I see those two modes becoming much more quickly more relevant and important to the future of mobility. And of course, when we say cycling, we're not necessarily requiring people to be as physically fit as we once were, because e-bike sales, the availability of e-bikes and their sales have increased substantially, offering a kind of new sense of liberation and independence for people who may be more limited in their mobility options, including perhaps not still being able to drive. Meanwhile, with walking, particularly where one's in a situation of being more in tourist mode, which might again be relevant to all age groups, but perhaps to older age groups in part, technology has really come to our aid now, because once upon a time we might not have chosen to walk because of not being able to answer 3 questions. Will I avoid getting lost? How long is it going to take me to get where I'm going? And how far is it, please? And thanks to developments like Google Maps navigation, all 3 of those questions are easily answered. And so with technology in our hand, again, if you have access to and an ability to use, that's unlocking the very humble mode of walking, but in a new liberating way that we perhaps didn't previously have. So beware of the hyped big stuff and keep an eye on the fundamental small stuff that can make a difference to so many more of our lives. Possibly of some great concern to older people where there's a greater reliance on public transport in the absence of the car is the fragility of that public transport system at the moment. I was chairing a session yesterday actually which was titled Social Distancing, the Death Knell of Public Transport, with a question mark. And I'm pretty confident that we can't afford not to have a strong public transport system going into the future for both environmental reasons, but also social inequality needing to be addressed and reversed rather than exacerbated. But we'll all have been seeing empty buses or buses now with small numbers of people wearing masks. That's not commercially sustainable for a private sector industry. And so one could imagine a rather dystopian future where the bus industry starts to falter and crumble as we cope with a massive economic crisis unfolding in the wake of COVID, into which come technologically based new innovations for mobility, which are not particularly centered on older people's needs, but are about enabling early markets, which might be more technology savvy, more mobile, younger people, which could create a much less accessible society for older people. But leaving on a positive to that question, coming back to walking and cycling and the greater use of digital communication, I do see that creating the opportunity for much more living local and acting global, which could enhance social cohesion as people live more locally, they shop more locally. You'll see more people walking and cycling. It will be more normalized in neighborhoods, which means for older people who perhaps have a narrower range of travel in their lives, in their daily lives at least, that becomes richer and more inspiring as part of their well-being.
Okay, you covered a huge amount of ground in the answer to that question, Glenn. That's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was wondering, listening to what a lot you're saying, a lot comes back to technology and digital technology and digitization of transport, if you like. Maybe later than a lot of other sectors in society, but transport increasingly seems to be requiring you to have access to digital technology. And I wonder if you just have a sort of reflection on whether or not you think that is potentially creating a society of two halves, those that can and those that can't.
Yes, I think, I mean, we're not very good, I think, as a society, partly because we put so much emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and maths as being what's critical to our future. We overlook the humanities and social sciences, and not least history. You know, learning lessons from the past. There's such a richness of prior experience, and I think some of the issues of social inequality are not new to the digital age. It's a new manifestation of inequality and the means to engage or not. And so I see, you know, parallels in the past with whether it's access to a car, it's now access to enabling technology. That, I guess, is always part of a continuous process of change. I don't even see it as being as straightforward as a single digital divide between the notion of haves and have-nots, because I mean, I certainly count myself as far from being on the bleeding edge of what technology has to offer. You know, I, relatively speaking, fumble around with my smartphone compared to my children, for example. So I think there's always going to be a point where different segments of society are more or less in tune with the very latest richness of opportunity that's available. Perhaps the question becomes sufficiency rather than capitalizing on the full extent of what's available. And I think we've seen, not for everyone, but I think we're seeing how the COVID lockdown has encouraged us to be more connected again within our families and immediate social networks, so that you get more peer support, so that people who aren't so digitally enabled are being supported by those who are, which creates actually quite a positive relationship, rather than relying on everyone being digitally enabled. But yes, I think you're right. It becomes increasingly difficult to cater for those who are digitally enabled, as well as those who, through choice or lack of choice, are not part of that digital age change going on. You can see just from a commercial point of view that it's very hard to maintain an offering that is non-technology based when perhaps 60, 70, 80% of your market is able to be served by technology enabled means.
Okay. Just to sort of wind up then, perhaps, I was just going to ask you, just for your reflections on the impact that the current pandemic will have on transport in the sort of the very near future. In fact, you've already mentioned you were hosting the discussion yesterday about the effect on public transport, and how walking and cycling are perhaps more prevalent. I guess the other aspect that we have seen is the exhortation to use our cars from the government. And I just wonder whether you have a sort of reflection on more broadly how transport will be over the next few years as a result of COVID.
Yeah, it's the question on everybody's mind, of course. And what it highlights, frustratingly really, is that we're dealing now with what are called really wicked problems. We don't necessarily agree on the nature of the problem itself. There are lots of different views and values. We have very little evidence, of course. We're inherently looking to the future where we don't understand how new dynamics will play out. And And whichever aspect of that we're trying to look at, it's inextricably linked to many other aspects that are also changing. So if you're looking at transport, it's affected by the economy, it's affected by the labour market, it's affected by where people are choosing to live. And all of those things have been affected by the pandemic. And of course, we're also living in a globalized society where there are geopolitical dynamics that could be affecting what happens in a post-Brexit UK. So all of that is a longhand way of saying we can't predict our way out of this. But this is why I think we do need to have, we desperately need a more vision-led approach. Some would refer to it as supply-led demand rather than demand-led supply. So instead of trying to anticipate the future and providing to support that, we really have an opportunity now in the uncertainty to shape that future. And I think it is giving us, both as individuals in society, as well as the main transport bodies and government bodies, pause for thought amongst the urgency of the pandemic to say, here's a chance for us to change perhaps in terms of revisiting our values, changing how we see the transport system, and indeed how we configure the supply. So one of the things I think is very important is what I've called triple access planning, which is recognizing that we're not just dealing with transport. People in society, older people included, ultimately this is about being able to have access to other people in our lives, goods, services and opportunities. And yes, the transport system, the motorized transport system provides that, but so too does the land use system. If we get that right, we're looking at how we plan housing developments in futures and revitalize city centres, but also this telecommunications system. And I think what we will see and need to see is a much more joined up examination of that triple access system, so that with more emphasis on walking and cycling, capitalizing more on digital connectivity for all age groups, if and when we're faced with further disruptions, whether they're to do with future pandemics or to extreme weather from climate change or whatever else might happen, we've inherently got more resilience to support the needs that we all have in society, to hopefully remain well in heart and mind, as well as economically stable.
Okay, well, I think that's great to finish on a positive note, and that there is a positive future out there for us in relation to some of these issues. So I think we've run out of time. So thank you very much, Glenn, for those insights and for those thoughts. And it's been really, really interesting to hear those. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. Thank you very much for having me.